Good afternoon, everyone. This is Sarah from the National Weather Service. We'll get started in just a minute.
Just click the computer audio.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is Sarah from the National Weather Service in Sullivan, and this is our final briefing on the spring flood outlook. Okay, let's get started. So to summarize, we have an above average risk for flooding in south central Wisconsin and an average risk of flooding in southeast Wisconsin. So there have been a few changes, and I will go through that in just a moment. Spring rain is going to be the main factor for flooding now that our snow has pretty much melted. So where flooding occurs and how bad it will be will really depend on who gets the heavy rain. And with saturated soils, we're going to more quickly get to that threshold this year. Lake Michigan water levels continue to be near record levels, so there's an above average risk of flooding and backwater effects of the river mouths near Lake Michigan, and that will continue into the summer, if not longer. And the risk for breakup ice jams is low. So what has changed? The risk of flooding has decreased somewhat, but impactful flooding is still possible, no matter how much heavy rain we get. So some changes. The risk of reaching moderate and major flood stage has decreased to about average. In south central Wisconsin, we still have an elevated risk of exceeding minor flood stage. But in southeast Wisconsin, the risk of exceeding minor flood stage has gone down to average. It was in the more above average category. And then in the Wisconsin River Basin, the northern portion of the basin still has quite a bit of snowpack up there, which still needs to melt. So we'll have to watch the rate of snow melt to see the impact on the lower portion of the Wisconsin River. So why these changes? Well, we've really had a best case scenario for a slow snow melt during a fairly dry period. So that created some room in the rivers to absorb that melting snow. But now those rivers are back up to higher levels, and we're not out of the woods yet. The breakup ice jam is low. It had been more in the low to moderate category because there's really not much ice left in the rivers. And mid to late March is looking on the wetter side now coming up. So that's something we'll have to keep an eye on for watching for heavy rain potential. Okay, so I'm going to jump right into looking at for specific areas. So the main thing I want you to take from this graphic is areas that have been highlighted as above average risk or average risk. In southeast Wisconsin, we have closer to an average risk of flooding. So this is far eastern Wisconsin and the southeast. And this is mainly because these areas had less of a snowpack, which has already melted, and the rivers are running closer to average for this time of year. But other areas of Wisconsin, other parts of south central Wisconsin, still has an above average risk for flooding. So that those areas had more water in the snowpack and most of that has melted, but some of it is still making its way into the rivers. So some of the slower responding rivers there are still rising, and rivers just in general are higher in this area. Now, I don't want you to focus too much on the numbers here, but I will explain a little bit about what that means. The shaded colors show the percent chance of exceeding various flood thresholds. So the orange colors show where you have elevated chances of exceeding minor flood stage. So you can see much of south central Wisconsin, the orange coloring in that area, there's more orange coloring indicating there's an elevated risk of exceeding minor flood stage across much of that area. And then there is one red square indicating a greater than 50% chance of exceeding moderate flood stage. That's the Wisconsin River at Portage. That area is just a little more susceptible to flooding, and we still have to melt all the snow up north, so still need to keep an eye on that location. But overall, the point I want to get here is that there is a above average risk for much of southern Wisconsin, and some of the printed values are there. That's the percent chance of exceeding minor flood stage. So generally an elevated risk for south central Wisconsin, and then an average risk for the southeast. So now I'm going to step through some locations and just take a closer look at some of our river basins. River at Portage. The blue line here shows the historical probabilities of exceeding various flood stages. So on any given year, what your chance is of exceeding a flood stage. And then the black line shows this year's projections. So the point I want to make here is that the probabilities are elevated this year for this location. So normally there is a 60% chance of exceeding a minor flood stage, and this year it's a 94% chance of exceeding minor flood stage. Now again, don't get too much into the details with these numbers. The point is there's an elevated risk of exceeding minor flood stage. And there's a 40% chance of exceeding moderate flood stage historically, and this year there's about an 80% chance of exceeding moderate flood stage. I think this number may be a little bit elevated. These projections were run a few days ago, and the next week is looking on the drier side. So that number I think will be a little bit lower. But again, the point is there is an elevated risk for flooding this year on the Wisconsin River. Okay, so let's take a look at the Baraboo River at Rock Springs. And this kind of represents the whole Baraboo Basin. The lines, the blue and black lines, are on top of each other for the higher flood stages. So this indicates an average risk of exceeding those higher flood stages, the moderate and major level. But there is an elevated risk of exceeding minor flood stage. So 50% chance of exceeding minor flood stage. This year that's elevated to about a 70% chance. Okay, and the Pecatonica River at Martintown. Again, similar story here. You see that for the minor flood stage, typically there's about a 41% chance of exceeding minor flood, and this year that's elevated to about a 70% chance. And then the lines are fairly close together for the moderate and major flood stages, indicating an average risk of exceeding those flood stages this year. Okay, let's take a look at the Rock River. This is for Jefferson, but this is pretty much representative of the entire Rock River Basin. You see elevated chances for exceeding minor flood stage. For this location, it's typically about 35% chance on any given year. This year, it's in the 99% chance, or still something pretty high. This river is slowly increasing right now. It's a slower responding river, and it's going up with the recent snow melt. So a good chance it may exceed minor flood stage. And then probabilities are about average for exceeding moderate and major flood stage. There's about a 20% moderate flood stage at this location, which is what we're expecting this year. And then here are a couple locations in southeast Wisconsin. The top one is the Milwaukee River at Cedarburg. The bottom one is the Root River at Franklin. These are pretty much representative of all the rivers in southeast Wisconsin where there's more of an average flood risk. So the lines are pretty close on top of each other, indicating that this year the probabilities are fairly close to historical or average. So for example, the Milwaukee River at Cedarburg, there's about a 20 to 30% chance of exceeding minor flood. And the Root River at Franklin, chance of exceeding minor flood stage. And then the Fox River at Berlin, there's elevated chances of exceeding minor flood stage. Typically, it's about a 20% chance. This year, it's about a 55% chance. And then for the moderate to major flood stages, probabilities are pretty close to average. Okay, so the why. Well, how did we get here and what factors played into our flood risk? So 2019 was the wettest year on record statewide and either the wettest or second wettest on a county level. And the past 6 years combined have been the wettest 6 years on record. So we've had a lot of water, and there's just a lot of water on the ground, in the groundwater, and in the rivers. Fall was very wet. Precipitation across southern Wisconsin was about twice the normal, and winter was on the average side. So a lot of water that we've gotten in the past 6 months. But the past 3 weeks have been a little bit below average. So that was perfectly timed when we had our snow melt. But despite this short-term dryness, soil moisture percentiles remain in the 99th percentile. So soils are very saturated for this time of year, and they've been saturated since last fall. So that is not going to change anytime soon. Rivers at the end of February had dropped to the normal level with that recent dry spell, which was good because then there was room to absorb this melting snow. But now that they've done that, rivers are back to the above normal category for most of southern Wisconsin. So with soils very saturated and groundwater being high and the rivers running high, water's going to more quickly run off when it hits the ground and more quickly make its way into the rivers. So this will cause greater flood potential across the board here. Okay, looking at the snow water equivalent. So pretty much all the snow's gone across southern Wisconsin except for some snowbanks and that type of thing. The water is still making its way through the system into the rivers in some areas of more south central Wisconsin. So we are still seeing the rivers responding to that snow melt. But if we look back at what we had, it was about 1 to 2 inches in the Baraboo Basin and the lower Wisconsin River Basin, and 2 to 4 inches of water contained in that snowpack for much of eastern Wisconsin from Sheboygan down through Beaver Dam, Madison, and down toward Monroe. So those are the areas where we have the above average risk for flooding just because there was more water in the system there. And then southeast Wisconsin had about a 1/2 inch of water in the snowpack. So southeast Wisconsin, that's why the flood risk is more in the average category. And then northern Wisconsin, the northern Wisconsin River Basin, there is still 4 to 8 inches of water across the headwaters of the Wisconsin River and 1 to 4 inches in the middle portion of the basin. So all that snow still needs to melt, and it will make its way down the Wisconsin River. So we still need to pay attention to that for the Wisconsin River and watch the rate of snow melt for flooding potential for the Wisconsin. Okay, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about Lake Michigan and the rivers near Lake Michigan. lakeshore flooding and then backwater effects from the high lake waters are expected to continue for those rivers for the foreseeable future. Lake Michigan water levels are at near record levels, and they're expected to stay that way into the summer. And even beyond that, it's going to take some time for the water level to go down. So impacts from that will continue. January and February set a record monthly mean values for each of those months. And the Army Corps of Engineers monitors Lake Michigan water levels and does the forecasts. And they are forecasting the lake to break its monthly mean record high levels every month from March to August by about 1 to 5 inches. And right now, March is sitting about an inch below the all-time high. So these water levels are going to be much higher than they were last year and much higher than the all-time or the long-term average, approaching the all-time high. Okay, so moving into looking at the outlook, mainly for the northern Wisconsin River Basin, because that's where there's still snow. We have to keep an eye on temperatures there. And we're looking at a good situation now for the continued slow snowmelt with highs in the 30s and 40s and lows below freezing. So that will help to slowly melt the remaining snow up there. But we will need to keep an eye on a more rapid warm-up that would melt that snow more quickly, combined with heavy rain. We are watching a system that could bring some widespread rain late next week. So that's still a ways out. We'll have to keep an eye on that. In the meantime, we are looking fairly dry over the next week until that next system. And looking farther out, we are looking at more of a wetter pattern for mid to late March. Above normal precipitation looks likely for the later portion of March, and then even the spring season as a whole. There's more uncertainty looking at far out, but odds favor above normal precipitation for the March, April, May timeframe. Okay, so in summary, there's an above average risk for flooding in south central Wisconsin, closer to an average risk of flooding in southeast Wisconsin. And spring rain is going to be the main factor now. Heavy rain is always a risk for flooding. So it's really going to be a matter of where that heavy rain is and how much. But south central Wisconsin is a little more at risk at this time. The overall risk of flooding has decreased somewhat from earlier this year when we had more snow on the ground, but impactful flooding is still possible wherever we get heavy rain. The risk of reaching moderate and major flood levels has decreased to about average, and that's mainly because we don't have the snow on the ground anymore. Now our risk is just really based on heavy rain. In south central Wisconsin, there's still an elevated risk of exceeding minor flood stage, and in southeast Wisconsin, the risk of exceeding minor flood stage is average. And then the Wisconsin River, we'll have to keep an eye on the snow melt and the rate of snow melt, which is really going to drive the flooding on the river levels in that area. And rivers near Lake Michigan will continue to experience flooding and backwater effects due to the high lake levels, and that is expected to continue into the summer, if not longer. And breakup ice jam risk is low since there's really not much ice left out there. So that concludes the briefing, and I will open it up to questions. So if you have any questions, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you, or you can type your question in the box. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions at this time. I will wait a few more minutes. But thank you, everyone, for joining. And if you do have any questions, feel free to call our office or send us an email. All right, thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Okay, Donna, I see you have a question. Let me try to unmute you. Okay, I think you're unmuted, Donna. Are you able to ask your question? You may have to hit your access code to unmute yourself. Otherwise, just type your question in and I can see it that way. Any other questions out there? All right, I am not seeing any questions, but if you do have some, please reach out to us via phone or email. Thank you.